The letter was sitting on my windshield when I walked out of the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon in early February. Not tucked under the wiper the way a parking ticket would be. It was taped there, flat against the glass, written on official-looking paper, with a logo I recognized immediately. It was from First State Auto Credit, the company that financed my truck, and the first line told me everything I needed to know before I even read the rest. 14 days. That's how long I had before they came to repossess it. I stood in the parking lot of that Kroger in Dayton, Ohio, holding a bag of groceries I'd paid for with the last of the cash in my wallet, and I read that letter twice. The cold went right through my jacket. People walked past me with their carts, loading up their trunks, going home to warm houses and normal evenings. I just stood there. My name is Caleb. Wait, I keep catching myself. Let me start over. My name is Ryan Hollis. I'm 28 years old, and until about 7 months before that Tuesday, I had what I would have called a pretty solid life. Not flashy, not perfect, but solid. I worked as a project coordinator at a mid-sized construction supply company called Harmon & Dale, based out of the west side of Dayton. I'd been there almost 4 years. I knew the inventory systems. I knew the vendors. I knew which foreman called too early in the morning, and which ones never answered their phones at all. It wasn't a career I'd dreamed about as a kid, but it was steady. It paid my rent and my truck payment and left a little left over each month. I had a routine. I had a plan. I thought I understood how things worked. Then the company got acquired by a larger regional firm out of Columbus, and within 90 days, our entire coordination department was eliminated. Not downsized, eliminated. 12 people shown the door on the same Friday afternoon in July with 2 weeks of severance, and a form letter that thanked us for our contributions. I remember carrying a cardboard box out to my truck that evening and sitting in the driver's seat for a long time before I started the engine. I didn't cry. I just sat there. I think part of me believed it would work out quickly. I had experience. I had references. I'd been good at my job. What I didn't have was enough saved. I'd been meaning to build up my emergency fund for 2 years, always telling myself next month, after this expense, after that trip. You know how it goes. By the time August turned into September and September into October, my savings were mostly gone. The rent on my apartment, the truck payment, the insurance, the utilities, none of them cared that I'd been laid off. They just kept coming, the same as always. I applied to everything I could find. Other supply companies, logistics firms, property management, even a couple of warehouse supervisor roles I was probably overqualified for. I had phone screens that went nowhere. I had second interviews that ended with emails saying they'd gone with another candidate. I had one offer that fell through when the company froze hiring the week before my start date. By January, I was behind on my truck payment by 3 months. The truck wasn't just transportation. I want you to understand that. In a city like Dayton, without a vehicle, you can't get to most of the places that might hire you. The bus routes are limited. Ride-shares add up fast when you have no income. That truck was my ability to show up to interviews, to get to a job if I got one, to pick up shifts if something temporary came through. Losing it wouldn't just be losing a vehicle. It would be losing the ability to keep trying. If you believe in second chances and in the kind of people who show up exactly when they're needed, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this one are the reason Mercy Stories exists, and I want to keep telling them. I started doing everything people tell you to do in that situation. I called the lender and explained my circumstances. They offered a 30-day deferment back in October, which I took, and then another in November, but after that they told me there was nothing more they could do on their end without a payment. I checked into every assistance program I could find in Montgomery County. Most of them had wait lists. One required proof of eviction to qualify, not just late payments. Another had already exhausted its funds for the quarter. I filled out the applications anyway. I checked the status every few days. Nothing moved. By the time I found that letter on my windshield, I had 14 days. I went home that evening and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. My apartment felt smaller than usual. I had $312 in my checking account, and the past due balance on the truck was just over $2,000. I didn't see a path. I want to be honest about that. I'm not someone who falls apart easily, but sitting there in the dark that evening, I genuinely didn't see a way forward. I just saw the walls of the room getting closer. I didn't tell my parents. My dad had retired early due to health issues, and my mom was working part-time at a pharmacy. They were getting by, but they weren't in a position to loan me $2,000. and I didn't want them to spend the energy worrying about me. I had a couple of close friends, but one had just had a baby, and the other had his own financial stuff going on. I felt very specifically like I didn't want to be one more problem in anyone else's life. So I kept it to myself. I went through the motions. I kept applying for jobs. I kept checking my email. I set my alarm every morning and got up and tried again. But there was something hollow about it by then. I was going through the actions without really believing in them anymore. 9 days before the deadline on a Thursday morning, I drove to the public library on East 5th Street. I had a couple of reasons. The library had free printing, and I needed fresh copies of my resume. And honestly, being in a quiet public place with other people around made the walls feel less close. I'd been spending too many hours alone in my apartment. I printed my resumes, used one of the public computers to check my email, and submit a couple more applications, and then I just stayed. I sat at a table near the window in the reading room. The light came in at a low winter angle, pale and gray. I wasn't reading anything. I was just sitting there, trying to think of what I hadn't tried yet. At some point, I noticed that the woman at the table across from me was looking at the papers I'd spread out on the surface. My resume, a couple of printouts of job listings I'd marked up. She wasn't being rude about it. She was just looking the way people do when they're trying to figure out what someone else is doing. She was probably in her early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a legal pad covered in notes in front of her. She looked like the kind of person who was always in the middle of something. She apologized when she noticed I'd seen her looking, said she didn't mean to stare. I told her it was fine, and then, because she seemed genuinely curious and because I'd been alone with it for so long, I told her what I was doing. Not the whole story, just that I was job hunting, that I'd been out of work for a while, that I was trying to figure out my next move. Her name was Frances Wentworth. She had a way of listening that was hard to describe. She wasn't nodding along the way people do when they're waiting for you to finish so they can talk. She was actually listening. She asked a few questions. What kind of work, how long I'd been in the field, what roles I'd been applying for. She didn't offer advice right away. She just listened. Then she set down her pen and told me a little about herself. She had spent 30 years in operations management, starting on the floor of a manufacturing plant in her 20s, and eventually working her way up to regional director of operations for a mid-sized logistics company before she retired 3 years ago. She lived in Kettering now. She came to this library 2 or 3 times a week because, she said, she liked the quiet, and she liked being around people who were still figuring things out. She said retirement was good in some ways, but she missed being useful. I wasn't sure where the conversation was going, but there was something in the way she spoke, unhurried, direct, no performance in it, that made me keep talking. I ended up telling her more than I'd planned, about the layoff, about the job's applications, about the truck, about the letter on the windshield, about the 14 days, now 9. I hadn't said most of it out loud to anyone, and saying it out loud to a stranger at a library table felt easier than I expected. When I finished, Frances was quiet for a moment. Not awkward quiet. Just the kind of quiet that means someone's actually thinking about what you said. Then she asked me one question. She asked me if I'd been applying mostly through job boards, or if I had any direct contacts in the companies I was targeting. I told her mostly job boards. Indeed, LinkedIn, company websites directly. She nodded slowly. She said that wasn't wrong, but it was probably why my applications weren't getting traction. She explained that at the coordination and project management level, most roles filled through referrals before they ever hit a public listing. What I was seeing on those boards were often the leftovers, or the ones companies were required to post publicly after they'd already identified an internal candidate. She wasn't telling me I'd been doing it wrong. She was telling me why the math wasn't working. Then she made me an offer that I didn't see coming. She told me she still had contacts at 6 or 7 companies in the Dayton and Cincinnati corridor. Former colleagues, people she'd worked with over the decades. She didn't make promises. She was clear about that. She said she couldn't guarantee anything, and that the best she could do was make some calls, put my name in front of the right people, and help me prepare for those conversations. But she said she thought my background was solid and that she'd seen people with less get into good positions faster once they had the right introduction. I didn't know what to say. I sat there for a second, trying to figure out why a person I'd known for 40 minutes would offer to do something like that. I actually asked her. I told her she didn't have to do this, that I appreciated it, but she didn't owe me anything. She pulled her legal pad closer and said something I've thought about many times since. She told me that when she was 31 years old, she'd been laid off from a job she'd had for 6 years, with a 3-year-old at home, and a husband who'd just started a new business that wasn't making money yet. She said she was drowning, and that a woman she barely knew, someone she'd met at a church rummage sale of all places, had made a few phone calls on her behalf that led to the interview that changed everything. She said she'd spent the 30 years since then looking for opportunities to return that favor to someone she didn't know. She said that was just how she understood the math of things. I went home that evening, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not certainty. I wasn't naive enough to think a conversation at a library table was going to solve everything, but something. A flicker of something that wasn't dread. Frances and I exchanged numbers. Over the next 2 days, she met with me twice, once at the library and once at a coffee shop on Brown Street. She went through my resume line by line and helped me reframe the way I described my experience. The language I'd been using was too operational, she said. I was listing what I'd done without making clear what the results had been. She helped me think through specific outcomes, improvements I'd contributed to, problems I'd solved. The resume that came out of those sessions looked like the same facts, but they read completely differently. She also spent time with me on how I talked about the layoff in interviews. Not to spin it. She was very clear she didn't want me to be anything but honest, but to talk about it with confidence rather than apology. On the third day, she told me she'd reached out to 2 contacts. One was a woman she'd worked with 15 years ago, who now ran operations for a healthcare supply distributor in Miamisburg. The other was a man she'd known since the early 90s, who had recently taken a senior role at a regional third-party logistics firm with an office in Troy. I want to be honest about what those days felt like while I waited. The truck deadline was still there. It didn't pause because something good might be happening. I was down to 6 days, then 5. I called First State Auto Credit again and explained that I was in active conversations about employment and asked if there was anything they could do. The representative I spoke to was polite, but told me the same thing I'd heard before. There was no further deferment option available. The account was scheduled for repossession action after the due date. She was kind about it, but the answer was the answer. I sold some things. A game console I'd had since college, a camera I'd bought 2 years ago with the idea of learning photography and never really used, a few pieces of furniture I didn't need. I got a few $100s together, enough to feel like I was doing something even if I wasn't sure it would be enough in time. On the 5th day, Frances texted me and said her contact in Miamisburg wanted to set up a call. Her name was Diane Purcell, and she ran operations for Centerline Medical Supply. Frances told me to be myself, to use what we'd worked on, and not to overthink it. The call with Diane lasted 45 minutes. She was sharp and efficient, in the way that operations people tend to be. She didn't waste words, but she wasn't cold. She asked specific questions about my experience managing vendor relationships, and about a particular inventory restructuring project I'd been part of at Harmon & Dale. I'd described that project in the new way Frances had helped me frame it, and I could tell from Diane's follow-up questions that it landed differently than it would have before. At the end of the call, she said she'd like to bring me in for an in-person conversation the following week. 4 days left. Frances called that evening to ask how it went. I told her and she was quiet for a moment in that way of hers, and then she said good. Just good, like she'd expected it. The in-person interview at Centerline Medical Supply in Miamisburg happened on a Wednesday morning, 2 days before my truck would have been repossessed. I dressed carefully. I drove down early and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes going over the things Frances and I had talked through. Then I went in. The interview was with Diane and 2 other people, a director-level person from their logistics team and someone from HR. It went for almost 2 hours. There was a moment about halfway through where they asked me to walk through how I'd handle a specific scenario involving a vendor delay during a high-volume fulfillment period, and I realized I wasn't nervous anymore. I was just answering the question. I knew what I was talking about. I'd done versions of this before. I stopped trying to perform and just talked. At the end, Diane walked me to the front door herself and told me they'd be in touch within a few days. I drove home in a kind of quiet I didn't know how to name. It wasn't hope exactly. I'd been careful not to need any specific thing to happen, because needing things too much had been exhausting. It was more like stillness. Like I'd done everything I could do and now it was out of my hands. The call came the next morning, Thursday. One day before the repossession deadline, Diane's number on my phone at 9:47 in the morning. She offered me the position, logistics coordination specialist, full benefits, a salary that was slightly better than what I'd made at Harmon and Dale, start date 3 weeks out. I'm not a person who cries easily. I want to say that so you understand what it meant that I sat in my kitchen chair after that call ended and cried for about 10 minutes. Not sad crying, just the release of something that had been held too tight for too long. I called First State Auto Credit that afternoon and made a payment arrangement using the money I'd scraped together from selling things, plus a small advance against my start date, that Diane's HR team was actually able to facilitate through a company program for new hires. I kept the truck. By the time my first paycheck arrived 3 weeks later, I was current. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something. Scroll down right now and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share one moment when a stranger did something that changed your direction. Your story matters. Someone out there needs to read it today. I've been at Centerline Medical Supply for almost 2 years now. The work suits me in ways my old job didn't. Healthcare supply logistics moves faster. The stakes feel more real, and the team I work with is good. I got a positive performance review at my 6-month mark and another at 12 months. I feel like I'm somewhere I'm supposed to be. But what I think about most, when I think about that whole chapter of my life, isn't the job. It's Frances. After I started working, I reached out to her and asked if I could take her to lunch. She agreed, and we met at a diner in Kettering on a Saturday afternoon. I told her what the job had turned into, and she listened to the whole thing with that unhurried attention she had. And then she said she was glad. I asked her why she'd really done it, made the calls, spent those hours helping me reframe my resume, sat with a stranger's problem like it was her own. I expected her to repeat the story about the woman at the church rummage sale, which was true and which I believed. But she said something else too. She said that when she'd retired, she'd realized that the thing she'd actually been good at, the real thing underneath all the job titles and the operational expertise, was seeing potential in people and knowing how to connect that potential to the right situation. She said she'd done that inside companies for 30 years and that it seemed wasteful to just stop. She said she wasn't a formal mentor or a coach. She just looked for the moments. I think about that a lot. The idea that some people carry their skills with them into every room they walk into, even a quiet library on a gray February morning, even at a table across from someone they'll never see again. The idea that being useful doesn't require a title or a program or a reason. That sometimes you just look up from your legal pad and see someone who needs exactly what you happen to have. Frances still goes to that library 2 or 3 times a week. I know because I've run into her there twice since then, both times by coincidence, just me stopping in to return something or find a quiet place to read. The second time, she was sitting across from a young man who looked like he was in his early 20s, papers spread out in front of him, and she had that look she gets when she's listening. Really listening. I didn't interrupt. I just found a table nearby and let the moment be what it was. Before I finish, please, if this story reached you, if any part of it reminded you that the world still contains people who show up for strangers, hit like, share it with one person who needs to hear something true today, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next on Mercy Stories. Because here is what I know now that I didn't know when I was sitting in the dark in my apartment with $300 in my account and 14 days on the clock. The thing that changes everything is rarely the thing you expected. It's not the program that comes through, or the application that finally gets answered, or the plan you made back when you thought you understood how things worked. It's usually a person, one person, in the right place, who decides that what you need is worth their time. One conversation that goes longer than it was supposed to. One legal pad covered in notes at a library table in February. That's the thing about kindness when it moves through a life. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with paperwork or a deadline or a logo you recognize. It just shows up quiet and steady, and tapes itself to the inside of something you didn't know was broken, and holds it together long enough for you to remember that you still have the ability to move forward. That's all it took. That's everything it took.